Afternoon. Well, when they gave me the topic of a seed to create conscious consumers, I was kind of confused as how do I link this to the Millennium Development Goals? And more importantly, how do I link this to the World Marketing Summit? And to be brutally honest, I got to say, I didn't even know what the Millennium Development Goals were. Okay? But I researched it, and to my pleasant surprise, I found that, Malaysia has a story to tell around education and how that fits within the Millennium Development Goals. Okay? And before I start, just one more point that I wanted to make. Is that I don't claim to be an educationalist. In fact, I was a global marketer with a Coca-Cola company across about 10 or 11 countries and only just returned to Malaysia. And I took up the challenge to be CEO and MD of LeapAd Services, which is the education service provider of Khazanah National. Khazanah is the strategic investment arm of the Malaysian government. I don't claim to be an educationalist, right? I'm a marketer. But before I launch into this subject, let me give you a brief picture about education in Malaysia and how it's evolved. Malaysia, as most of you know, achieved independence in 1957 and it inherited independence from the United Kingdom. And the education system that it inherited was a very fragmented system. There were four different school systems. There was English, Malay, Chinese, Tamil. It was a kind of a dysfunctional system because only students in English and Chinese medium schools could go to secondary schools. During that time, education was not readily available to everyone. In fact, primary school engagement was an appalling 58%. Adult literacy was an embarrassing 52%. Okay? And there were reasons for this. Firstly, schools were not accessible because of geographical distance from where they lived. They were in rural areas. But secondly, and more importantly, was poverty. Fundamentally, parents wanted their children to stay home and help them with earning an income as opposed to going to school. Okay? So in summary, the picture was pretty bleak. Okay? To address this dysfunctional situation, as I call it, the Malaysian government invested a lot of money in education. In fact, it kept doubling its investment every year in education, and today spends 21% of its annual budget in education. And it's all focused around providing the right infrastructure in terms of number of schools, and also forming a lot of education acts to address the inequities that existed, and things like abolishing school fees, which happened with the Education Act of 1961, making primary school education compulsory, which was in the Education Act of 1966. And the emphasis was put on to literacy and basic numeracy, or 3 R's as they call it, which is reading, writing, and arithmetic. And also providing assistance to low-income families. Okay. So what you see up there is a few of the game-changing efforts in increasing accessibility to education for the general public. Okay. Here's where we are today. There was a huge increase in enrollment of both primary school and secondary schools within the next 50 years. The picture you see up there comes from the Malaysian Education Blueprint, which was launched only on September the 6th, which shows that primary education in the last 30 years has hovered around 95%. It's a big shift from the 58% in 1957. The biggest improvement was the enrollment of upper secondary students, which was an increase of 45% to 81% in the last 3 decades. What this means is that 81% of students in this country get at least 11 years of education. Right? They stay in school for that period. And I think that's a huge shift from where it was before. Now, how this links to MDG 2, the good news is that today Malaysia has achieved near universal education. In fact, it's achieved very close to it, at 96%, and literacy at 99%, which means 99% of young Malaysians can read and write. Now, universal education fundamentally has two elements. One is getting seats in classrooms where students actually go to it and stay there. The second is that they actually remain in school till at least they finish 11 years of schooling. Okay? So, as a Malaysian, a returning Malaysian, I can proudly say that Malaysian education system should rightly celebrate its exceptional success in raising the levels of both elements of accessibility and to education. Okay? That was a cue that you should give an applause to the Malaysian education system. Right? Thank you. Now, having said that, we can't sit on our laurels on the fact that we've achieved near universal education, primary education. Okay? The question here is this enough? On paper, we've achieved near universal education, but really, is this enough? The question here is about the quality of education now. Is it sufficient or relevant for students in the 21st century? Is it sufficient to create Malaysians who can be globally competitive? Because we live in a global environment, and can these students be globally competitive? When I lived in many countries around the world, I lived and worked in a number of countries around the world, 9 to be exact, and in each of those countries I used to interact with Malaysian students because Malaysia has this obsession for, Malaysian parents, this obsession for education, and they send their kids overseas. Right? And I found during different festivities, like Hari Raya, which is a Muslim festivity, or other festivities, the students couldn't really mix around with the others, and I used to invite them to my home. And because I was an expatriate, I usually had a large home and a swimming pool and so forth, so I could create a nice environment for them to come and celebrate Hari Raya with us. And I asked them, how come you guys are not with the local students and doing something? And I found that they couldn't communicate, they couldn't share ideas, they weren't global. They weren't ready to be in a global environment. Okay? So the question to the answer, is it enough, is simply that it is not. And let me give you some background to why I think it's not and why we are in the situation where we are. Okay? I'll give you a couple of seconds to absorb the couple of pictures up there. The one on the left is a bit dramatic. I know there are no classrooms with students with what looks like an abacus in front of them. But the picture on the right is very much what it is in Malaysian schools today. The education system of then, and even today in many parts of the world, is a paradigm of production. Okay. The classroom is teacher-centric. The teacher is in the center, source of all knowledge. Students are expected to pay attention to the teacher in order to gain knowledge. Students are passive. For most parts, the students stay silent. When I was in school here in Malaysia, if you talked in class, you were sent to detention. As opposed to encouraging me to talk, and the teacher would then try and divert my thought, my speech and attention to something useful, I was said, you don't speak. If you do, you go for detention. It was about rote learning. Much of the learning is done through memorizing facts, keywords, and figures. Okay? And this is the scene in most classrooms here and in many parts of the world. Okay? Now, let's see what a typical production line looks like. Okay. Supervisor-centric. Supervisor, the center of the production line. The supervisor gives orders, the workers will follow. Passive workers. Similar to a classroom that we just saw, workers are expected to stay silent for most parts and do what they're supposed to do. The task is highly monotonous. So the scenario in our factories is very similar to the scenario in the classroom. So the education paradigm we know today is a result of public education being conceived in the 1800s during the Industrial Revolution. The paradigm in which schools are seen as places of production. And in order to support the paradigm of production, the education system adopted a standardized learning and testing, which was actually modeled after Chinese Mandarin examinations. Now, standardized learning is a system that promotes conformity, which was exactly what corporates during the Industrial Revolutions wanted. Okay. Education was used to solve two challenges: the challenge of finding enough compliant workers and the challenge of finding enough eager customers. Okay. In both challenges, what the corporations needed were people that conform and comply to the majority without further questioning or thought. Okay. But this is no longer relevant. The paradigm of education cannot serve as a paradigm for today. Okay. And so what I want to talk to you about is the fact that we have reached universal primary education, and we can't sit on our laurels now because we want our children and our students to become globally competitive, to be part of the 21st century. Okay. And this is why. The world is changing rapidly. Economies all over the world are making the shift from production to knowledge-based services. So as the economical focus has changed, so there's a shift in skills expected for the 21st century individual. So we're living in an information era. Information is increasing at an exponential rate, and it's becoming more accessible. So a 21st century individual has to be skilled in being able to sift through mass of information to decide as to what is relevant, what is not relevant, what is right, what is not right, what should be questioned, what should be followed. And they need some skills which are 21st century skills. And those skills are mainly described as creativity, higher order thinking skills, independent learning, and co-creation or collaboration. Okay. So Malaysian employers, as I'm sure employers all around the world, are expressing concern that the current education system does not produce competent employees that can deal with this knowledge explosion. So there is an explosion in knowledge. Today learning is not restricted to the classroom, it happens everywhere. Students are bombarded with massive amounts of information from all directions. Knowledge comes in a continuous fashion now, no longer in a standardized manner. So the question I ask is, are we preparing our students for this expansion? I know we had to take them from what was there in 1957 to making sure that education was accessible to everyone, but now is to raise the bar, because we can't be content with that. We have to prepare our students for the 21st century. And media is part of that explosion. In the past, people relied on libraries, newspapers for information, but today, in the information age, search browsers and social networks contribute to the ease of obtaining information. In fact, in a post in Reddit, a social news website, one user asked his fellow netizens, if someone from the 1950s suddenly appeared today, in this website, what would be the most difficult thing to explain to them about life today? So among the many answers, here was one answer, is I possess a device in my pocket that is capable of accessing the entirety of information known to man. I use it to look at pictures of cats and get into arguments with strangers. So this is the power that our students have. Are we preparing them for this? And not to over-dramatize the point, the exposure starts from a very, very young age on information. And this is coming to my topic of education, the seed to a conscious consumer. From infancy, people are in developing economies are increasingly bombarded with an array of information, including marketing messages. And a statistic from the Center of New American Dream, the average American kid is exposed to 25,000 television ads, spanning over 10,700 minutes over the course of just 1 year. Okay. It is extremely imperative to teach individuals from young to discern information, both good and bad. In short, resisting it is quite futile because it's everywhere. Discernment is absolutely mandatory. So today, everyone is a consumer of information. Similar to consumers of products in markets, it's important for students to be able to make mindful choices on what information to consume, what to discard, because there's a vast amount of information out there. Because of that, schools must cultivate students to become conscious consumers of information. In other words, education really is the seed to create a conscious consumer of information. This should be the type of individuals that our education produces, one who is versatile in the skills of the 21st century and also able to make mindful choices on information to consume. And to make my point, allow me to show you a short video clip around this subject. And I hope when I do this, it works. So apologies for the sound effects. I don't know what happened to the technology. But the point is that, to reiterate the point, the current challenge of the education system is to develop individuals into conscious consumers of information. Here's a depiction of what is a rash consumer and what is a conscious consumer. So a rash consumer, some of the characteristics on the left, eager customers are ready to consume items that are produced. They seek for the lowest price. They tend to wait for solutions rather than think for themselves. They're always seeking to purchase more items with the money they have, trusting literal marketing messages, passive recipients of brand communication. On the right, a conscious consumer, they seek for total value for things they buy. They're focused on creating their own solutions. They seek for meaningful experiences from the things they buy. They look for information beyond marketing messages, and they're active co-creators of content, products, and experience. So conscious consumerism goes beyond the purchase of products and services. It also relates to the discernment of information. So in terms of a conscious consumer of information, here's some of the things they would look for, even from a classroom point of view. Okay. They'd ask, is the information credible? What can I infer out of what I'm reading or being subjected to? Is there more information I can find out about this rather than reading the headline on what's been given to me? How does this fit into the big picture? How do I use this to solve problems? And how may I add to this information that I've just received? Okay. What I describe as a conscious consumer has two main characteristics. It's the 21st century skills of creativity, collaboration, higher order thinking skills, and independent learning, but also the ability to make decisions, to make mindful, responsible decisions. And therefore, education today needs to instill both the 21st century skills and decision-making. The shift has to go from a teacher-centered classroom to a student-centered classroom, where students learn by doing and being more engaged. The emphasis is on collaborative learning. Teacher functions as a facilitator or guide students' train of thoughts, and students learn to process and analyze information. Okay. This morning I was with a very well-known and very impressive Professor John Hattie. Some of you may know him. He's from Melbourne University. And when I asked him about, so where do you think all this should go, and what's the next step? And he said, you know, I've gone past TIMS and PISA, and these are terms to describe different measurement methodologies that are there. He said, what is the most important right now is collaborative co-creation. He said, that's what I'm focused on, and that's what students need in the 21st century. It's about collaboration. But we need to start this at a very young age. Guidance in this form of learning needs to start from primary stage. In primary school, children establish their self-identity as learners. Children in this information age are exposed to information from a very, very young age. Now, the Malaysian Education Blueprint, which I said was launched on September the 6th, has recognized the need to adequately prepare young Malaysians for the 21st century. Okay. In fact, they identified, as part of many things, they identified 6 attributes that every student should have, which includes knowledge, thinking skills, leadership skills, bilingual proficiency, ethics and spirituality, and national identity. And so the Malaysian Education Blueprint addresses these 6 areas, And in addition to that, it has identified the fact that you do need to have public-private partnership in being able to achieve the aspirations of the Malaysian education blueprint. You can't do it alone. And there's a saying, and I think it was said by Hillary Clinton, I could be wrong, it takes a village to educate a child, a whole village to educate a child. It takes parents and community, it takes the public sector, the private sector, and it takes a lot of people to educate a child. So the Malaysian education blueprint has fundamentally got 11 shifts in getting to this 21st century learner and globally competitive kids. And the 9th shift is where we come in. It is about the public sector partnering with parents, community, and the private sector at scale. And it's headed and spearheaded by a foundation called the Yayasan Amer Trust Schools Program. And LeapAd, the company I manage, is the education service provider to the Yayasan Amer Trust Schools Program. A little bit about LeapAd. LeapAd transforms learning in Malaysian public schools. It is a social business, and what I mean by that, it is run on the principles of a social enterprise, but it also runs very, very firmly as a business, with all the disciplines and accountabilities of a business. And our service intervention programs will lead to 4 pillars, which are around school leaders, teachers, students, and parents. And it's about transforming learning in the country. Okay. Because we understand that teachers shape the minds of students who shape the future. So a lot of our interventions with programs like Teach Smart is to change the pedagogical skills and the leadership skills of leaders and teachers in schools. Okay. And the focus really is on a student-centered approach which allows students to develop skills required for the 21st century. Students are placed in a role where they learn from one another through cooperative learning. It's a hands-on learning approach, and students will gain these skills of creativity, collaboration, high-order thinking skills, and independent learning in the classroom, but facilitated by the teacher. In addition to that, they will allow students to practice decision-making by working in a collaborative manner. Now, students become lifelong learners, so learning is not just in the classroom, it's also outside the classroom. So the core curriculum activities that are developed are also there to instill 21st century learning in students. So this is the new education paradigm of the century to create conscious consumers of information to prepare students for the challenges of the 21st century. And I think somebody earlier talked about an example, analogy of man and fish. Well, no longer do we provide the hungry man with fish because his appetite has grown. Instead, you teach the man to fish in order to satisfy his ever-growing appetite. In closing, I want to quote a Malaysian headmaster of a school in Kuala Lumpur where he said, "The heart of education is education of the heart." So the 21st century learning is about educating the heart of our students to be creative, to co-create, to develop higher order thinking skills, and to be independent learners so that they can be globally competitive. Okay? Thank you very much.